the free things in life, the things that sometimes we take for granted, and we're looking so forward to be able to get back to those things. With all these stay-at-home orders that have been in effect, it seems like for the last 50 years, although it's not been that long, but that's just how it feels. We've been hearing a lot more lately about the Bill of Rights. I've heard more about the Bill of Rights in the last few weeks than I've heard probably the last few years of my life. And people who are wanting to get things back to normal, they've been talking about the Bill of Rights. And I love the Bill of Rights, don't get me wrong, appreciate our country's Bill of Rights. But don't you wish sometimes that we could come up again with our own list of Bill of Rights? I love the ones that we have for our country. I don't want you to misunderstand what I'm saying, but it would be nice if we could come up with our own list and maybe add some things to this. And one of these things would be this: every child has the right to be reared by a loving, by a kind, by a gentle, godly mother. Shouldn't that be the right of every child that comes into this world? But unfortunately, that's just not the case. If we truly wanted something that would really change the world, this would be it, wouldn't it? It's not in Washington, D.C. It's not in all of these places that we so quickly look usually. But how would it change the world if every child had a gentle, kind, loving, godly mother? In Exodus, we read about one such woman, and this mother's name was Jochebed. There are not volumes written about this good woman, but there's certainly enough to know what kind of woman that she was. As a matter of fact, we're going to get to Exodus here in just a moment, but let me just start in a different place. If all we knew about her was what was written about her in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 23, where it says, by faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents because they saw that he was a beautiful child and they were not afraid of the king's command. If that's all we knew about her, that would be enough to tell us what kind of woman that she was. But we know some other things about her as well. She and her husband's courage changed the course of history. Think about this. Because of this woman, and I know preachers are often prone to hyperbole, but I'm not exaggerating when I say this. This woman changed the course of world history, and not just that, but she changed the course of eternal destiny, of eternity. This woman had a part in changing all of those things. We're going to notice some things about this woman that makes her place in history even more remarkable. She was born a slave girl. She was born into slavery and was a slave. This woman did not have the benefits of wealth or class or political clout. She was considered by the elites just to be a common, ordinary, average woman. And so we could look at some of the things that she did not have. Well, let's look at some things that she did have. What made her who she was? There's 3 things that we'll explore this morning together. And we're going to see that any woman could have this. Any mother could have this. Any woman, any mother could develop these things that she had. You don't have to have money. You don't have to have clout. You don't have to be known by the world. But there are some things that if you will have and you will place them within your role as a mother, it will help you become the type of mother that Jochebed was. Number 1. We see that Jochebed had courage. She had courage. Get your Bibles and look with me to Exodus chapter 1. Exodus chapter 1. And we're going to start with verse 15. We're going to read some verses in this just to kind of get us a little background of this woman and what was going on in her life. Exodus chapter 1, starting with verse 15. I know a lot of you know about this. A lot of you have heard her name. A lot of you have read this account before, but I'm always excited about the possibility within an assembly such as this of somebody never having heard this story before. Doesn't know who Jochebed was, doesn't know who Moses was. There's a good friend of mine, a man who is now a gospel preacher. His mother obeyed the gospel before he was ever born, but she became unfaithful. And during his whole rearing, she did not take her children to Bible class or to worship. Later on in life, before she died, she was restored. But this young man, we studied the Bible together, and one of the things that was so neat about that study is he didn't know any of the Bible class lessons that you learned from the time before you were in kindergarten. And he was just so amazed at Noah and the ark and all of this. And so I'm always excited about the fact, obviously we would rather be taught when we're young, but I'm always excited to think that maybe you don't know about this woman. Maybe you've never heard about what happened to Moses. And so let's get a little background here so we can display her courage. Exodus chapter 1, verse 15. Then the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, of whom the name of the one was Shiphrah and the other name was Puah. And he said, when you do the duties of a midwife for the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stools, if it is a son, then you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, then she shall live. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the male children alive. What his fear was, the Hebrews, even though they were in slavery, were gaining momentum. They were gaining strength. And when the population should be declining, it was getting larger. And so his recourse for this was to kill all the Hebrew baby boys that were being born. And so this were the instructions he gave to the midwives. Verse 17, rather. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the male children alive. So the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said to them, why have you done this thing and saved the male children alive? And the midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are lively and gave birth before the midwives come to them. Therefore God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very mighty. And so it was, because the midwives feared God, that he provided households for them. Now watch verse 22. So Pharaoh commanded all his people. Now it's not just the midwives. Now it's all the people, saying, every son who is born of you shall be cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive. So now here is just the command for everyone. A male child is born of the Hebrews, kill it. The daughter shall be preserved alive. This was what was going on when this took place. But we see something about this great woman, Jochebed, is that when she had children, she decided when she had, Aaron, Moses, and Miriam, she wasn't going to just give her child up to a godless nation, to a godless society, to a polytheistic country and society and kingdom. She wasn't just going to give her children up without a fight. She had a decision to make. When this child was born, I know what the king has told me to do. I know what the government has told me to do. I know what other people might be doing. I know I'm supposed to, according to the king's command, turn this son over to Pharaoh to be killed. Or I could risk my life for the protection of my son. Here's some great advice for young people, but it also is something, adults, that we need to be reminded of from time to time, especially if we are parents. We tell our children, and we try to instill this in them, but it's something that we ought to be paying attention to even ourselves. And here it is. The first thing to ask yourself when presented with a problem is this: is it right or is it wrong? Is it right or is it wrong? If it's right, this is what we're going to do. If it's wrong, this is what we're not going to do. Now, we tell our children that, but parents, that's just as applicable to us as well. Is it right or is it wrong? And be determined to do right. Be determined before the situation ever comes to you, before you even ask the question, I'm going to strive to do right. And then we ask ourselves the question, what is right? And what is right, we do with all our might. What is wrong, we avoid with all of our might. God give us parents. God give us mothers who are willing to take a stand for what is right. Parents who expect more of their children than the world does. I know the world has very low expectations for our children. Have you ever heard this? Well, boys will be boys, girls will be girls. And I agree to that to a certain degree. Boys will be boys. Boys, we like to handle our disputes in a hand-to-hand combat sort of way. Rough and tumble. Boys will be boys in some ways, and girls will be girls in other ways. We understand this. But sometimes we just say, well, you know what? This world, it's changed. It's different. It's not what it used to be. What can I do as a parent? It's just the way it is. Joshua chapter 24, another passage that is well known, and it should be well known. He talked about, coming through a land, being in Egypt for all those years when they were exposed to the multiple gods that they served there, and going into the lands and conquering those lands as they were getting ready to conquer, seeing all the various gods that they were exposed to, and seeing all of this for so big of a part of their life. And they present the people with a challenge. Decide today, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods on the other side or the gods on this side. But as for me and my house, you remember what he says, we will serve the Lord. Why? Because he's the only true God, which makes him the right God to serve. What's right? To serve God with all of your heart. So choose you this day whom you will serve. Me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Our children come into this world ready to be guided. You agree or disagree with that? They come into this world ready to be guided, to be directed. And they come, it seems, ready to learn about God. Just pay attention to children and just watch them. And watch a child's faith. And it seems like they just come ready to have their faith hole, whatever you want to call it, in their heart filled, and they run with it. Their faith, the faith of a child, needs to be developed from the very beginning. You've probably heard the illustration that a congregation in the Corn Belt they were going through a drought, and the leaders of the congregation and all the churches around were very concerned about this because so many in the congregations were farmers, and their whole livelihood depended on this drought ending. And so all of the elders from the various congregations in the area said, let's all get together and have a prayer meeting. Let's all approach God. God's the only one that can save us now. Let's all get together and pray about this situation and just beg God to send the rains immediately. And so all of the elders, all of the deacons, all of the preachers, all of the godly women, all of the godly men get together and come together in this one big group prayer meeting to pray for the drought to end. But only one little 5-year-old boy brought an umbrella to the prayer meeting. He taught those older people what faith is. If we're going to ask God to send the rain immediately, then I'm going to need an umbrella to get back out to the car after the prayer meeting's over. Don't waste the spirituality that young people have. I know all of us would lament how it seems all over our country, at least, that attendance in gospel meetings and lectureships in many places seems to be on the decline. But you know what's not? Youth rallies, youth camps, Bible camps, There's so many of our camps now that have a waiting list of young people just begging to be able to go to study the Bible for an entire week together. You see? What a tragedy not to take advantage of the faith, of the spirituality that young people come with, given to them by God. We need mothers who will have the courage to make the determination, to have the courage to say, I'm going to, if I don't do anything else in life, I'm going to instill a faith in my child that will last for the life of that child and for generations to come. And I'm willing to make the sacrifice to make that happen. Number 2, closely related to that, but different in some ways, Jochebed had great faith. Look at Exodus chapter 2 now. Look at verse 3. Well, let's start back up to verse 1. And a man of the house of Levi went and took as wife a daughter of Levi. So the woman conceived. We read in other places, Numbers, and a little bit later in Exodus chapter 6, what her name was, Jochebed. So the woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was a beautiful child, she hid him 3 months. Hid him 3 months. What do young babies do almost constantly anytime they're awake? They cry. Imagine trying to hide a newborn baby. Look at verse 3. But when she could no longer hide him, she took an ark of bulrushes for him, daubed it with asphalt and pitch, put the child in it, and laid it in the reeds by the river's bank. Let's look at her faith. No wonder she's in the Great Faith Hall of Fame, because she needed this type of faith to accomplish for the Lord what she did accomplish. She had to resist the world, as we've already seen. The world was crying for the death of her son, but the mother said, no, you're not going to get my son. And so she had the courage to go against the king's command. You know, I read this, and I know the Bible, and we've heard this so many times in school, the Bible was not written to satisfy Mark Reynolds' curiosity. And I understand that. It gives us facts, it gives me things. But you know what? It also gives me the opportunity as I read these things to just stop for a moment and think about things. And there's not a thing wrong with that. I think God expects us to do that. Here's the facts. Here's the words. Here's what you need to know. Now spend some time and meditate on that. Don't you know that David did that? In thy law doth I meditate day and night, that righteous man does. And so we meditate on certain things. And we read about one Hebrew woman, Jochebed, who hid her child, put him in an ark, put him in the reeds, put him in the water, and then watch to see what would happen. And what I wonder is this. I wonder how many other Hebrew women, when they had a son, I know that keeping this son might cost me my life, so I cannot take that chance. So I better turn him over to Pharaoh. And if I were to guess, I would guess that that number was probably pretty high of the women who did that, but not Jochebed. I'm willing to take the chance, even if it costs me my own life. I'm not just going to hand my child over to the world. I'm not going to do that. I refuse to do that. I'm going to fight the system. I'm going to fight the commands of those people who are godless, who are trying to take my child from me. Rather than just handing them over, I'm going to fight for my child. And isn't this exactly what the world is clamoring for us to do with our young people? And I'm just going to give you some of my pet peeves. Take that for what it's worth. You got your own pet peeves. You add or subtract whatever you think seems to just be a picture of what our world is today. But it seems that children come with the right to have a cell phone by birth. That's one of the first things I think the doctor hands to them when the child comes out of the womb. Here's your cell phone. And I'm not here to tell you what age. I will tell you, we gave in too early to our third child. Isn't that how the third child is? But the amount of information that they can get on that thing and what they can see on that thing, we don't just give it just because everybody else is doing it. Evolution, well, that's just going to be how they're taught today. We can't do anything about it. And I understand if you go to school, that's what you're going to be taught. But you realize you can tell them the other side of that? You mean you're going to take your child out of the game to go to Bible study on Wednesday night? We need that child here. Why is your child dressed differently? Why do they do things differently? Why do they not act? Because we're not just going to give up without a fight. We need parents who will teach their children the ways of God and steer them clear of the world, rather than just giving up without a fight. And then she had the faith to release that child. And I like to think about this as well. Took great faith to hide that child for 3 months, to risk her own life to do so, and then to make that ark and to place that child in the river. The same instrument that was being used to kill other Hebrew children was used, the river, to save this child. And I can just see in my mind's eye her placing that ark in the water and then taking her hand off and saying, God, I trust you to do the rest. It takes faith to let our children go, but that day is coming, and it's sooner than we think. I'm not talking that we leave our children altogether and they're just left to fight for the rest of their lives without our involvement. That's not what I'm talking about. But to do all of the preparation so that we can let our children go with confidence. What foundation will they have when they leave our home? As it turns out, Moses would come back to her, if you read the rest of the story, because God intervened, his providence. Who happens to find the child? Pharaoh's daughter. And then watch what happens in verses 11 and 12. Exodus chapter 2, 11 and 12. Came to pass in those days when Moses was grown. Moses was grown. He's going to do something. Look at verses 9 and 10. Let's read those two. Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this child away and nurse him for me. So she gets to nurse her own son. I will give you your wages. And she gets paid to do it. So the woman took the child and nursed him, and the child grew. And she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. So she called his name Moses, because I drew him out of the water. But now watch this. And this is the beautiful part. So you get the picture. There's Jochebed. She places the child in the water. Pharaoh's daughter finds the child. Miriam intervenes and said, you want me to find one of the Hebrew women to nurse this child? Well, yeah, this one right here is just ready to go. And she gets paid for doing this. But then not only that, so she gets her child back. And for that time, imagine that, ladies, imagine that. Until this child is weaned, whatever age that was, I've got an opportunity to teach my son some things that he needs to know before he goes out into the world. Imagine that time crunch that's coming. As soon as this child is weaned, I'm going to have to give him up. Just think, what would you teach your child first? He needs arithmetic. He needs math. He needs to know how to read. This child needs to know how to make a deal, how to be successful. He needs to know, well, hey, you need to start saving some of your money early in life. And all of those things are important things. But what do you think goes through her mind? What do I have in this limited time that I've got Moses back with me? What do I need to instill in this man? Watch how it sticks. Verse 11 and 12. It came to pass in those days when Moses was grown. So he went back to Pharaoh's daughter's house. She reared him the rest of the way, and now he's a grown man. That he went out to his brethren, and he looked at their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, watch it, one of his brethren. Wait a minute. I thought he was Egyptian now. I thought that once he was brought up by Pharaoh's daughter, he would become one of them. He would be an Egyptian. But no, he still remembers, here is one of my brethren being mistreated. Watch what he does, verse 12. So he looked this way and that way, and when he saw no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the stand. He's saying he still remembered who he was. Mothers, we have our children for such a short amount of time, and all of those other things that are mentioned are important to instill in them, but they need to know who they are. They are a child of the King. They are a child of Almighty God. They came from Him. They'll go back to Him. They are children of Almighty God. What will we do with the opportunity we have at the time of our children in our home? And then number 3, and lastly, and quickly, she had love, verses 9 and 10. Let's read that passage again. Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages. So the woman took the child and nursed him, and the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. So she called his name Moses, because I drew him out of the water. She gave of herself, and she poured out herself into the life of her son. Isn't that what every good mother does? Isn't that what every good mother does? You know, sometimes Mother's Day is tough on some people. Maybe some have lost their mothers and all they have is memories. Maybe some of your mothers weren't good. Didn't do the things that a good mother should. And so it's painful for you to think about your mother on Mother's Day. But that's one of the great things about the Bible is even though I may not have had a good mother, you can still be a good mother because you can see what a good mother does. Listen so carefully to this last point. We're almost done. The day a mother has a child, she will be making sacrifices, a good mother will, for the rest of her life. Fathers too, but we're talking about mothers today. And let me take you to a passage in the New Testament, Titus chapter 2. This is a passage that used to bother me a little bit. Not that I thought it was wrong or anything like that, because I know it's right. I believe it's inspired. I know that it's inspired. But I didn't get for a long time because it just seems that certain things should just come naturally. In Titus chapter 2, we read, starting in verse 1, this is Paul writing to Titus. Here's some things you need to do. But as for you, speak the things which are proper for sound doctrine, that the older men be sober, reverent, temperate, sound in faith and love and patience. Now watch verse 3. The older women likewise, that they be reverent. So these are some things that you need to be teaching them. Be reverent in behavior, not slanderers, not given to much wine, teachers of good things. Now watch verse 4. That they admonish or teach the young women to love their husbands and to love their children. And here's the problem I had with that, is that I would think that that type of love would just come naturally. You wouldn't have to teach a mother to love her children or how to love her children, but that would come naturally. But then you look in the world and you see where that's obviously not the case. Because if it were the case, there would be a lot more better mothers in this world. Rather than so many who have absconded their role as a mother to other people. Grandparents, you raise my child. Teacher at school, you teach my child. Sunday school teachers, you teach my child. I'll have this child as long as it doesn't inconvenience me in the least. That's not love. But man, do we see that in our culture and our climate today in our country? Mothers, make those sacrifices. And I know that they've got to be difficult. I know there's going to be hard times. But the Bible promises us that those sacrifices that you make while rearing your children will pay off in dividends that you could never fathom in your life. You know, one of the things that we seem to forget, at least I do from time to time, and I have to remind myself, is that we read people like Jochebed and her husband, and we forget that when they were doing this, they did not have a clue on how it was going to turn out. Much like the things that you and I go through on a daily basis, we have to trust God, but how in the world is this going to turn out? And that's how it was for her. She was struggling through life and had no clue that her son was going to be the one to lead her entire tribe, her entire nation out of slavery after over 400 years. Her boy was going to do that. And can you imagine the buttons that would pop off of his dad's chest when he said, "That's my boy." The one that just separated the waters from the waters, that's my boy. That's my son. And imagine just how proud she had to be. But my point is, when she was putting that ark in the water, she had no clue the potential of her son. It wasn't her job to know the future. Her job was, I'm going to prepare this boy for whatever comes to him in life. And mothers, that's your job. Can you imagine when Moses, talking with God, receiving the 10 Commandments, and God got to this command where he says, I want you to make sure that this is a command that my people know forever. And here it is. Honor thy father and thy mother. Can you imagine just Moses' heart being filled with joy? Thinking, well, man, that will be the easiest command I'll have to keep. Because he had that type of mother. Mothers, we love you so much. We appreciate you so much. Hopefully this has been a good reminder for all of us of what's the most important thing in life. If you are not a Christian today, that is the most important thing. Will you become one? Do you believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God? Will you repent of your sins? Will you confess your faith in Jesus? Will you be baptized into Christ so that your sins can be washed away? Perhaps at one time you obeyed the gospel. Come home. Do right. What's right? Be resolved to do right for the rest of your life. We'll pray with you and for you. All together we stand and sing.